you, both of you. I've had a fantastic 2 weeks in North America. I've been up in Chicago and chatted to the editor of Christianity Today. I went down to Nashville and talked to Ed Stetzer, and then I shot over to Des Moines where Brian McLaren was speaking and had time with him. And then went to the New Wineskins Conference and have now ended up here and had this punishing schedule that Bill kept adding to, and it's been wonderful. This week has been sensational for me. And Jenny said, oh, you know, in her introduction, you know, she was thinking maybe we ought to introduce fresh expressions into Pittsburgh. You don't need to do that because I've seen it here. So when we talk about fresh expressions of church, and I'll give you a little bit of a history of where that term came from. We're talking about the sort of things that I've seen this week. So I went and had a conversation with someone who is planting churches in her community. We were in a laundromat. And they've got to know people there, and these folks come once a month. They meet with them. They give them the quarters who will pay for the cleaning, and they chat and hang out with them. And we did a little bit of dreaming, because who knows what the Holy Spirit will do. But we did some dreaming, and we said, you know, say you were able to do this every week. You know, it takes them an hour and a half, apparently, to do their laundry there. You know, I learned all sorts of things in this conversation. And, you know, just say you hang out with them for every week for an hour and a half, and you start doing a little bit of conversation about Jesus, and a little bit of Bible study perhaps, and a bit of prayer, and you just go step by step. You know, you don't have a great program or anything, but you let the Spirit take you each step. What would it look like? Oh, it could look a bit like church, but not in a building that we normally associate with church, but in a laundromat. That's a fresh expression, or something that could be on the journey towards a fresh expression of church. And then you see this morning I go up to the village there here, and there are two people who've been working perhaps 2.5, 3 years. And they start with the 8-year-olds and some ages either side. And they invite them to come to, I forget which day of the week it is, but 4:30 they come, and they have something to drink, and they have some activities, and they have sort of story time, and they begin to learn about the Christian faith, and they eat together. And they started with the older siblings coming as well, the teenagers, because they're supposed to be looking after these younger kids. And as they build the trust, and the siblings will leave them there, and they're beginning to do work with the 12 to 14-year-olds. And they're saying, yeah, but we need to think about, you know, middle school and high school age. We can't do this all together. And they talk about how some of the parents or some of the adults have become involved and are starting to cook the food. And saying even, you know, can we buy the food, which is a big deal for them. And they say, no, don't buy it. What we need is your hands. Just cook it. And other adults beginning to get involved, you know, 2 of them helping with the groups. You see, you've got something going on here which is really interesting. You know, it's got the marks of the Spirit on it. And it's beginning to look like church for young kids. And they go out in the community, and they'll, you know, they've got a little project they're going to do this spring. They're going to help those little children to repot some plants, and then take the plants to this, you know, to the adults and others who are living in this area of government housing. And they've done other sorts of activities like that. You know, this is church in the making, isn't it? What we would call in Britain a fresh expression of church. You know, I come across the Atlantic, and here it is. We had in our seminar this morning a bishop from Brazil who was talking about the 300 surface churches in Brazil. You know, they form a church among the people who serve. And they meet after they come out of the water, and if I understood him right, the surfboard is the sort of holy table. 300 of these. We've got one in Britain. That was remarkable. But there are 300, and they're about to start one in Hawaii. Particularly amazing for me, since I can't swim and I can't stand water. More remarkable, really. So, when we talk about fresh expressions of church, these are the sort of things that we're talking about in the UK. I could talk to you about a bread church that emerged in Liverpool that's been written about. A Methodist minister who spent a whole year just walking the streets of Liverpool, feeling called to a ministry there, but not knowing what the ministry was going to be. And she watched, all times of day and night. What was the rhythm of this city? What do people do? Where they hang out? How do they live? And then she heard someone talking about how they would just love to have the smell of bread that their mother used to bake. And zonk. The spirit rings in her mind. And she gathers together a few friends who she's met, and twice a week they come together and they start baking bread. And they make that known to all the contacts. All sorts of people turn up and join them in the making of bread. And if I remember right, they give one loaf away, they take one loaf home, and they do something with a third loaf, which I can never remember what it is. But the structure is, you see, they bake bread. Now what do you do when you bake bread? You talk. So community forms as they're baking bread. And then the core would go away at about 12 o'clock, and they would withdraw to celebrate a very simple Eucharist. And others could join if they wanted to. The sort of rule was you listened, but you didn't, argue with each other. And then you go back and have lunch, and then the bread would be baking and so on. Church beginning to emerge. I think of a couple of doctors, as I understand this right, general practitioners, who have started in Dorset in the UK, what they call healing room. The patients come to them and they plough them with all the medication that probably does more harm than good, but they keep giving it. And then there are cards around and there are notices, and they might drop it into a conversation. But if they want to come on Monday evenings, there's a community there that will pray for them. And so patients will come and they'll come back, and they'll come back regularly, and that becomes their church. They wouldn't use that language, but there are these patients coming back and coming to the Lord and finding support and different types of healing. Think of someone who, a couple who moved on to a poor council estate. And they spent 3 years, they're totally middle class, they've got as plumbing and an accent as I've got. And they live with these poor people, and they do their professional jobs. She said to me, she said, they have no idea what I do, because they don't have those sorts of conversations. And she started a little Bible study group. 3 of them were Christians from similar backgrounds. The one from Liverpool and so on, come from poor backgrounds. 3 or 4 not Christians, but exploring. And then they start planning together. And they plan this afternoon, which they're going to start monthly. They've held the first 1 or 2, and they're going to do it monthly, and then more regularly if they build confidence. And they just invite the families they know. Come, bring food. And they come, and the children arrive, and there's some activities for the children, all ages. And the adults just chat away. Then there's a very simple Bible story, acted out perhaps if they want. And then they all eat together. And you can tell that I don't work with this sort of people, because it was counterintuitive to me. What they said, that even the people on benefits, we ask them to bring food, because we want them to know that they are valued. And we're building into this community right from day one the idea that we all give and receive. Some very important missional principles here. No one's actually taught them this, the Spirit's just led them into it. And when I talked to her, and I said, tell me more, she said, well, one of our visions for this is, from our professional background, we're trained to do everything well. But what we say is we don't want to do this well. We want to do it in such a way that the folks who come say we could do better. They understand about mission. And I said to her, what happens when they want to explore the faith a bit more? She said, I'll get them together in a Bible study group. And she said, the first thing I'll do is to try and find out, I'll probably know by then anyway whether they can read or not, so that'll influence what sort of group it is. And then she said, you know, the principle will be, I'll try not to answer their questions. So when they say to me, who's John the Baptist, I'll say, well, let's just Google it. Because what I want them to learn from day one is that they don't have to rely on me. But they can rely, first of all, in their language, they'll be relying on the group and the internet. But as they grow into the faith, they'll recognize that what's going on is that the Spirit is working through one another. And so they will lay in these foundations that will mean that they'll be able to withdraw. And this group will be self-sustaining, led by one another. And she said, you know, even now as I get to know some of these folks, I can guess that they may have a gift in this area or a gift in that area. And as they come into faith, we'll see whether they can exercise them, whether they're right or wrong, and who cares anyway. But, you know, that the Spirit will allow them to share and pool their gifts and resources together. Some of the most moving things for me in the UK has been to listen to some of the stories of folks who are just starting out and being church in their context, and sometimes saying, you know, I don't know if I got it right. I don't know what we're doing here, really. It just feels that this is the right thing to be doing at this time. Most of them do not proclaim what they're doing from their housetops. Most of them are a bit shy, a bit embarrassed, a bit reticent. That their mark very often is insecurity. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if I've got it right. It's very humbling, and you sense, you know, kind of tingling in your fingertips. Gosh, you know, this has got a feel of the Spirit about it. It doesn't have a great feel of big humanity here. They're sort of broken people working with broken people. All they're sort of ordinary people, just you know, doing ordinary things. You know, an assistant rector who runs an alpha group and says to the alpha course at the end, have you enjoyed it? And they say, oh yeah, great. If only church was like this, we'd come. So she said, well, that's fine. Church can be like this. We'll meet again after Christmas and we'll just carry on. And so they carry on with the meal and the food and so on. Well, that group didn't work out very well because a whole lot of other Christians joined. It was great, and changed the dynamics. And so she saw one by one these original folks drifting away. So I always say to people, if you're doing this, don't let the Christians wreck it. You know, with 2 or 3 Christians, great. Best to have the majority of people who don't believe when they start, but don't let it get flooded out time and time again. You know, someone said to me, you know, we just have to keep telling people we're not a zoo with animals that they come and look at. But we don't want these visitors. But we want them to pray for us and love us and speak well of what we're doing. So, you know, great to have a prayer group behind you. Great to have prayer partners. Fabulous. But just be careful, because all sorts of things could happen. So you see, this sort of thing's been going on. It's been going on for ages in the UK, just as it has, I'm sure, in the States. But what happened was that in the mid-2000s, early 2000s, some of this stuff had been tracked, and accounts were written about it from the Sheffield Centre, Church Army Research arm. And there was a recognition that something was going on here under the radar. So that was a little bit different. And so the Church of England, in its wisdom, appointed what churches always do, which is a committee. And this working party came up with a report called Mission Shaped Church, which reported on what was going on and said, this is what we're observing. They won't say this is what we ought to be doing, they'll say this is what we're observing that the Spirit is already doing. So let's join in, let's bless it as a church, encourage it, and see what happens. And they use some incarnational theology based on sort of Jesus being in his culture to justify what they were recommending. And this report was approved by General Synod, but the reason it became probably the best-selling report in the Church of England, certainly in the last 100 years, is that Archbishop Rowan Williams became Archbishop of Canterbury at the same time. And in Wales, where he'd been Archbishop, he'd come across some of these new expressions of church. And he'd gone and listened to them and watched them, and he'd said, because he's a man of God, I can see the Spirit at work here. And he had that sense, and he read about it, and he read everything he could on the subject. And as he came to Canterbury, not many people really picked this up in the church press. But it was his number one priority. He had two number one priorities, and this was one of them. And he was absolutely committed in the discretionary time that he had to support these new types of church. And so when Mission Church report came out, which happened to coincide with his translation there, he went forward for it. It became clear that he was absolutely committed to this. And that really was very influential in the Church of England, because most of the people on the Mission Shaped Church Working Party were from an evangelical background. But here you had someone from a totally different churchmanship, with in many ways a different approach to theology, certainly in the ethical side of his theological reflections. So this is a great thing too. So the Church of England fell behind it, and so did the Methodist Church joined in. They set up a small team called Fresh Expressions, which I work for, to encourage it. But I really think in the whole scheme of things, we didn't make much difference, because this stuff is happening on the ground. And the Spirit is working on the ground bottom up. To give you some sort of scale of it, the Sheffield Centre has been doing some research around some of the dioceses. And they've basically been ringing up anything that is called a fresh expression or might look like a fresh expression, and they've been interviewing them on the phone for an hour. And they've been asking, anyone tell us anything that could look like a fresh expression? And so, say, in the Liverpool diocese, they might have had 130 names. They have a pretty rigorous definition, so 40 or 50 of those get excluded from the final figures. But if you take the figures that they ended up with this very rigorous definition, which I'll come on to in a moment, 30% of churches, Christian communities in the Anglican Church in Liverpool, are these fresh expressions. These fresh expressions, which mostly don't meet on a Sunday, the people they are in touch with, the number is equivalent to 10% of all those who are worshipping on a Sunday. 19 started between 1999 and 2005. 54 started between 2005 and 2011. In other words, this is an accelerating trend. All but 4 of these are still going. So the 19 started before 2005. Well, you know, at least 15 of them are still going. These are really interesting figures. 20% of the people who attend these fresh expressions are Christians. 35% were people who used to go to church but have stopped going to church. 40% are people who've never been to church. This is really interesting. Okay, you know, I wear a sociologist hat, so I can be totally cynical too. You know, you ask a church leader for figures, they're always going to exaggerate. I've been a church leader. I've filled in the Church of England book. You know, when I've had an off day, I've pushed 12 to 15 to make myself feel a bit better. You know, this is what we do. It's not something to be particularly proud of, but, you know, we exaggerate. But even if you allow for the exaggeration, just the sheer hard numbers that there are 30% of something that looks like church, 30% of them are these fresh expressions is remarkable. Figures for Canterbury are not that different. They're doing now studies in Leicester and Derby and elsewhere. So what I think is most interesting about these figures is that 25%, 20 of them, of these fresh expressions, about a quarter in all, no one had ever heard of, certainly not the diocese. So you see, something's happening here under the radar. And I think to myself, well, if this is happening within a diocese, within a denomination, and they haven't heard of it, what's happening outside the denominations that we've never heard of? I'm based at Wycliff Hall. We do open days. I was talking about fresh expressions to one of our open days, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, well, we're probably what you call a fresh expression. We've never used that name, but we're a heavy metal congregation in Soho. And went on to talk about how they were amazed that this church opposite had been existing for 1,000 years. I know the church, it's an Anglo-Catholic church. They now do things together once a month. Isn't that interesting? You see a heavy metal congregation
worshipping with an Anglo-Catholic church. It's not the sort of script we normally write. But you see, it's a very sort of postmodern phenomenon. And it allows me to say that the language that we've used in the UK is the language of mixed economy, which says that existing church and these new churches both have a place in God's economy. One is not better than the other. They both have distinct ministries to distinct groups of people, and they complement each other, and they're at their best when they love and serve each other. You see, and I think of that heavy metal congregation. If that Anglo-Catholic church wasn't there, how would they get drawn into this wonderful Christian tradition that we've been blessed with? Who would draw them in? And this Anglo-Catholic congregation, I suspect its numbers are declining because in so many of our Catholic and evangelical churches, the numbers are declining. So where's its future in 10 to 15 years' time when the baby boom generation have passed away? Where's its future? But here is a gathering that brings new life into the future. You see, it's the old and the new loving and blessing and being enriched by each other. And this is what we find exciting in the UK, those of us who are sort of committed to this. That the Lord is doing a new thing that is also renewing and blessing an old thing. And the old thing is going and giving something wonderfully to the new lot. Someone said to me in another one of our open days at Wycliff, Peter probably didn't realize that the open days were so productive for my research. But, you know, another woman said to me, she said, I didn't have time to explore this with her, but she said, you know, we've had a fresh expression in our parish. It has transformed our church. And it's been a real blessing to us. So what are these fresh expressions? How might you try and sort of define them? We've come up with a fourfold definition. I have to say, to begin with, if as a team we were to reflect on our journey, we'd say one of the mistakes we made was not to hold to a tight definition. We allowed the definition to be quite loose. And what happens, I don't know what happens over here, but in the Church of England, you see, I mean, all the bishops and the archdeacons and the clergy, I mean, most of us, well, we're supposed to be pastoral in our heart. And so there's an easy tendency to say, let's make this challenge too stretching for people. Let's make it too hard. Let's make it easy. So, okay, a fresh expression, let's call it anything that's new. Anything that's new. Let me tell you, I'm not joking. One church put up a new church notice board and said, we're doing a fresh expression of church. And the trouble is, you know, if you want people to become a high jumper, if you want someone to be a good high jumper, you don't keep the bar at the bottom the whole time. I mean, these Olympic high jumpers, they wouldn't be where they are now if the bar was never raised. What happens is you put up a high bar and then you train people to jump it. And the mistake we made was to allow too many of our senior folks in the Church of England to get away with, not that we could stop them, definitions that were actually so broad as to be unhelpful. And you diluted the vision and you lost the vision. I want to say in parenthesis that my observation is, I may be wrong, but my observation is that over the last 2-3 years, every diocesan bishop who's been appointed has in some way been signed up to this agenda. Gives you some feel for the commitment in the Church of England. I also want to say Methodist Church totally involved. The Congregational Federation, United Reformed Church, Church of Scotland involved. The Salvation Army are getting involved. We're in conversation with the Assemblies of God. Baptists are sort of nibbling away. This is becoming a truly ecumenical venture. Malcolm Muggeridge, one of our commentators in the 1960s, said that ecumenism reminded him of the pubs turning out at night, and everyone would hold each other in case they all fell down. And it may be that in the Church of England, our denominations are becoming so weak that we all need to prop each other up. I just say hallelujah, because it's a great thing to be doing. So 4 characteristics. First, these fresh expressions are missional. Their focus is on people who don't currently attend church. Secondly, they're contextual. They seek to form community and be community and allow church to emerge in a way that fits the context. New Creations was started by a woman in Liverpool who loved making cards. And she gathered her friends around her who make cards, make birthday cards and so on. About 40 of them who meet together. I said this afternoon, I'm amazed there are 40 people in the whole world who like making cards, but there we are. So they meet together, and of course a lot of these cards are, can be made for seasons of the year, for Christmas, for Mothering Sunday, for Easter, you know, throw in Fathering Sunday, for harvest, and so forth. And so this woman, who was a reader in the Church of England, she would talk, when they were making cards for a church season, she would talk for 5 minutes about what that meant to her as a Christian. And as she did these talks and got to know them through her conversations and so on, at a particular point, she just said to them, would any of you be interested in joining a small group to explore some of these things more? A whole lot of hands went up. She recognized a number of them as being Christians, so she encouraged them to form a conventional Bible study group. But the others she recognized as being very much on the edge of church. And so they formed a little group where they could explore. The first thing I think they looked at were some of the stories that Jesus told. Some of the parables. You know, you start with the prodigal son. You know, if you've got women there, you know, they're going to talk about that story forever and ever. So they came and they met and they just walked a journey exploring Scripture. And when I was last in touch with them, they were talking together, how are they going to put in a little communion, a Holy Communion act of worship as part of the lunch that they always have together every week. See, church emerging in its way, in its context. Nothing very profound, you know. Yeah, I write this dirty, great, thick book about the theology of contextualization. Frankly, it's common sense. It's just what you do that feels natural in your context. So these churches, they're missional, they're contextual, they're formational. They have the idea or the aim or the intention of making or allowing the Spirit to work through them to make disciples, to form disciples of Jesus. In the Liverpool Fresh Expression survey, 80%, 4/5, use mentoring, small groups, or drew people into working teams as ways of encouraging them to be followers of Jesus. The other 5th, almost certainly, were fairly new and so hadn't got to that stage. So these they have the intention of discipleship. And one of the things that some of these emerging churches are discovering is that there is a cognitive element to discipleship. You do want to draw people into the big story of God. And you long and you want them to learn that story. And there are umpteen ways you can do that. You know, you can do podcasts. If you're in Oxford, you can get them to read books. You can do short little talks and have lots of discussion. There's so many ways you can do it. But the other bit is you want them to learn how to practice the faith. You know, what are the skills that you need, if you like, to practice being a Christian? And some of the learning that these groups are discovering is that sort of discovery of the skills is modeled in their community life together. You know, when you eat together and you share together, you begin to discover what it's like to live a Christian life. You know, the father whose own father never played with him as a child can't really imagine what it means to play with his son or daughter. Sees another family and sees another dad playing with his children. And you think, oh, okay, I could do something like that. You know, that happens when communities live together and share their lives, not in a great, profound, deep way, but just eating and having fun together. So there's this sort of mixture of some cognitive stuff. I think we've probably got a lot to learn on that side. And some of this practical stuff. I was talking to Brian McLaren. He's writing a little book on, I forget what he called it, catechesis or something. But, you know, he's making the point that one of the things he's going to recommend, I thought was pure genius, that if you are an emerging church you might just say to folks, this month we're going to practice humility. And so come back every time we meet for this next 3 or 4 sessions and just talk together about how you found that experience. And when they come back, you might say, now just share together how you found the experience of trying to be humble over the last week. Don't worry if you completely forgot. That's what we all do. Just be humble enough to say it. But share together. Now, there's nothing like knowing that you're going to have to come back and talk with other people about how you practiced a bit of the Christian faith to put that on your agenda. You do that for 4 weeks. And then you say, hey, folks, for the next 4 or 5 sessions, let's talk about generosity. What did it mean for us to be generous in our everyday lives? And so, that's not the only way of doing it. There are lots of different ways, but you try and build in very practical ways of putting onto individuals' agenda, and if you're the leader, your own agenda, this way of walking with Jesus. And then fourthly, they're ecclesial. They're ecclesial in the sense that they're not designed and don't seek to be stepping stones to church that already exists. They seek to be church where they already are. And this is so easy to do. I think of a luncheon club. In a small English rural community, imagine your typical nice, pretty English church. Had the pews taken out at the back, so on Wednesday, 20, 25 people, older people, come and have lunch together. And the leaders one Wednesday said, what we've thought we'd just try as an experiment. It took them ages to get to this decision. In England, we seem to take ages to reach conclusions about some things. But they said, what we've decided to do is we'll bring down the holy table into the chancel. We've put some candles on it. And after lunch, if you'd like to stay behind, we'll just gather around. We'll play some Christian music. We'll light the candles. We'll read a passage from Scripture. We'll have some quietness. We'll say a few prayers. And then last about a quarter of an hour, and then feel free to leave. Out of those 25, 20 people stay behind. And you imagine that journey. You do this for a number of weeks. People getting comfortable, and then someone says to you at the end, leaving, you say, I didn't really understand that Bible passage. And so you say to the group, would it have helped if just for 3 or 4 minutes, one of us had just explained what was going on in the passage? Oh, yeah, please do. Well, would you mind if that meant that we were here for 20 minutes rather than a quarter of an hour? No, we've got the whole afternoon. So you're introducing what we would call a sermon. And you just allow the little steps to go. You can't plan it in advance. Tell you what I love about these fresh expressions is that they're totally non-programmatic. There's no plan or strategy. They all often do have a plan. I've known people who've said, our plan is to start a youth congregation. And they ended up with a gathering of people with disabilities. And frantically, they had to rush off this couple and talk to anyone that ever worked with people with disabilities to find out what they're supposed to do with these folks that arrived in their lounge. The Spirit is so full of surprises. So you can have ideas. You can have ideas that we would bring this little gathering around in the holy table, and we might do it like this, like this. But as you relate to the folks and talk to them, Spirit might take you in a different direction. But the possibility there of a little congregation emerging, and if I was the rector in your language, you see, I'd be going back to my fellow clergy, and I said, now beat this. Sunday before last, I had 20 people in my church worshiping on Sunday morning. I've now got 40 worshippers. We've doubled in size. I bet none of you can beat that. But so easy, because all you've done is taken what you've already had and taken them on the next step. The book that one of the reasons I'm here in the States is I'm writing a book pitched towards ordinary church leaders, ordinary people in the pews. And the theme of the book is we all want to make a difference in our Christian lives, but so many of us find it difficult to do so. And one of the reasons for that is that the model we've grown up with is that the church gathers together as community for worship, but then in our everyday lives we scatter as individuals to live out the faith. And it's really hard to do that when the world is organized, but we're kind of on our own. So at the end of an Anglican Eucharist, when we have the dismissal should be, go and find one or two other Christians in the passion of your life and find ways of serving with those other Christians the people who are around about you. So if you love photography, go and find one or two other Christians who love photography. Gather together other people who love photography. This is a real-life example from South Wales. Gather together, in this case, women who love photography. Advertise it on the internet. And as they come, start doing great things together as photographers. You know, have some competitions. Have an exhibition. Share your photographs. And then when Christmas comes, why don't you suggest to them, why don't we take some photographs that will speak about how we think of Christmas? Straight away, you're beginning to have your conversations about spiritual things. And you just build on that. You take other themes of loneliness, of poverty, of the ecological crisis, whatever sparks them, and you begin to have these more profound conversations. And so you begin to put in signposts to Jesus. And the thing about this, you see, so many people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, they're really busy, they've got families, they're peaking in their careers if they're lucky enough to have a job. Life seems hectic, so you go and say, oh, by the way, in the midst of all this busy life, will you do mission as well? This feels difficult. But if you so, actually do what you're already passionate about. You're passionate in your work, find two other Christians. How can you serve your workplace? Just bring them some croissants on Friday and give it to them free. Do it every Friday. First Friday will be really embarrassing because they'll all think you're nuts. But after that, they'll get used to the fact that you're nuts. And you just meet together and see what happens. If someone says, we'd love to help you, say, great, why don't you join us? We have a little planning meeting, twice a month. And what we do is we think about how we can love and serve people in our workplace. And then we look at the Bible passage. We'd love to hear your comments on some of these passages. And we pray. We don't have to pray out loud. We can be quiet. And we just come and join us. And so they come and join you, and they begin a journey with you, which we hope and pray through the Spirit will be a journey into faith. And that's not an addition to your life. It's just enriching a part of your life that's already important to you. And I think that this is the step that we need to take in Britain that we haven't quite taken yet, which is to mobilize our churches and ourselves to find, neighbors so we can care for our neighborhood. Whoever it is, just 2 or 3 people to pray with in order to serve the context. We have lots of these groups already, but they tend to be inward looking. They meet for prayer and Bible study. They never get to the serving of people outside. Well, you can change that very simply by changing the dynamics of the group. You don't start with prayer, and you don't start with talking about yourselves. You start with your purpose. How are we serving this context? And you go on talking and praying until eventually the Spirit suggests ways that you might do it. And then you might talk together about the problems and how you do it, and you might do some planning, and then you do your praying and your Bible study in the context of what you've done. Now, if you do that sequence, you can never leave your missional purpose out of your meeting because you've always started with it. Are you with me? So how do these sort of churches emerge? And then we'll stop and we'll have time for questions and comments. They tend to emerge through a very simple sequence. This is a model. In real life, it always looks more messy and it's complicated, and these stages overlap, and this is a model. Okay, they start with listening. There's 2 or 3 people, or 4 or 5 or 8 or whatever. They listen to that context, and the question they're asking God is, how can we love and serve the people in this context? And so the second stage is beginning to love and serve the people in that context. So, I think of a church for young people in Reading. And the group moved into the area, and they hung out with the teenagers at the school gate. and they listened to them, and they found ways of beginning to love and serve them. They'd go to the court with them and speak on their behalf in the court hearings. These were kids who didn't have any church background and were probably pretty unclubbable in our language. They would help them to get home when they were marooned at midnight. And so they just found ways of being good friends with them. I think of another church in northwest London, and they were aware of a whole lot of ethnic women in their area who couldn't speak English. And so they started a language cafe. And on Thursday or whatever during the week, they gave them an English cup of tea and some cakes and things. And they encouraged them to sit in tables, and in the tables they gave them topics to talk about so that they could practice their English. Practical ways of loving and serving your context. And then as you love and serve the context, a third stage is you allow and encourage community to form. Often this happens spontaneously, but sometimes you have to be intentional. In the case of that church for young people, or the focus on young people in Reading, they formed small groups where the young people could hang out together. There weren't games or anything there. They just hang out together to chat. In the case of the language cafe, if you were being intentional about forming community, you might say, okay, let's, for the first few weeks, encourage the women to stay in the same tables so that they really get to know each other. And then after that, let's find ways of just mixing them up a little bit so they're beginning to have a sense of identity with the whole group. If you're being intentional about this, you might say, actually, we won't buy a dishwasher. This is probably unthinkable in America, but we won't buy a dishwasher. What we'll do is we'll encourage the women to come and wash up themselves. Why? Because when you're washing up, you talk. And what happens when you talk? Community begins to form. So you just think of anything you can do to help community to form. And then as community forms, you begin to put in some signposts to Jesus. So this language cafe, I remember the woman talking to me and she said, we've got this so far, but we don't know how to go to the next step. We don't know how this could ever become church. So I said to her, well, you're a group of Christians who are leading this, aren't you? And she said, yes. And you've got a team, yes. And you pray together, yes. So I said, well, why don't you just put up a prayer board, and just ask the women to put in prayer requests and pin them to the board. You could say to them if there's something there that's confidential, they can come and talk to you, but otherwise get them to pin their prayer requests. See what happens. So when I met her 6 months later, I'm hopeless recognizing names. I hadn't a clue who she was, but she came up to me and she reminded me of this conversation. And I said, okay, what happened? And she said, well, all the women put up their prayer requests, and they're now talking about their prayer requests. You see, and that gives them permission then to introduce spiritual topics into the topics at the tables. And I said, well, what happens next? And she said, well, we're thinking of doing an alpha course. And amazingly, these were I met her at conferences, and I was speaking again to a whole conference in the London diocese of about 250 assistant rectors, curates we call them, as part of their training. And for some reason, I hadn't really thought about it, but for some reason I used this example. Someone said to me afterwards, oh, the woman, she's just been ordained, and she's here in the groups. I went and searched her out. I said, what happened? She said, oh, the Alpha course was great. She said, I've moved to another bit of London, and I'm going to do it again. So you find your pointers to Jesus, your signposts, and then as the next stage, you create a sort of intentional opportunities for people to explore Jesus. They put in an Alpha course. This church with a focus on young people, the step they took was they had the meeting in groups, and then they put in a weekend where they invited the young people away for a weekend, and they explored the gospel over that weekend. Through doing that regularly, a trickle of young people came through to faith. They now have 40 young people worshipping as a worshipping community. It's taken them 10 years to get there. And they were blessed in having a bishop who was extremely helpful. And the bishop sat down with them and they said, you know, our problem is before breakfast, we have a new initiative. And we've done umpteen initiatives, but we've seen no one come to faith. So the bishop said, let's sit down and draw what you're trying to do. And so they drew it, this case, as a circle. You know, we make contact, build relationships and put into small groups. Then we go to the next stage, which is the weekend away. And then the next stage is a gathering that's worshiping Jesus. And they said that has transformed the way we think. Because now we ask ourselves, well, if we do a new initiative, how does it contribute to that circle? And they said, now that we can think in this pattern, we see that the step between getting them into small communities, groups, and the step to coming away on the weekend, that's a big step. And so the question we're asking ourselves now is, what little steps can we put in to help them? And so having this sort of picture, you start with listening, you find ways of loving and serving, you encourage community to form, you create an intentional opportunity for people to explore Jesus if they want, you allow church to emerge as people come into faith, and the dynamic that, as it were, helps people to travel through those journeys towards Jesus is the signposts that you put in. These signposts might be through conversation or some of these other ideas. Now, that I would suggest is it's intuitively, it's actually, I think you see it in the Gospels. I think actually, if you read between the lines, and you can see how I've done that. I wish Peter Walker was still here. He could tell me whether I've read too much into the New Testament, but I think you can actually see it if you look carefully at St. Paul's approach to doing his missionary work. But it's certainly intuitive. If you're trying to reach people, we found in the UK, and I'll stop, we found in the UK that the traditional forms of church planting are brilliant if you're trying to connect with people who are in transit between churches, who used to go to church, have dropped out, but wouldn't mind going back to the same sort of church experience if it was a bit better. And so traditional church planting is great, and we have that, and it works a treat, and those are important people. Jesus loves them passionately. But we found in our culture that more and more people have very little church background. And these traditional forms of church planting don't really connect with them. But this way of being church, which is what I observed in the two examples and others that I've seen here in Pittsburgh, is a way that people can make a journey towards Jesus. And I love it for this reason. As a true blue evangelical of my age, I've been brought up under people like John Stott and Leslie Newbegin. So for the whole of my life, I've heard church leaders who I've respected say there is no tension between social action and evangelism. They both complement each other. And I said, yeah, I believe that. The trouble is I can't see it on the ground. I don't see examples of where this is happening. It sounds great, but show it to me. And the great joy for me in the last 10 years is I've seen it in my lifetime. Because when I look at many of these fresh expressions, they are combining care, social action. It's small scale. Sometimes it's quite radical. We've got, justice churches and so on. But they're combining that with evangelism. And that says to me it's whole, it's holistic, it's the whole gospel. And the brilliant thing about this little journey I sketched out is that each stage has its own integrity. You might simply do no more than listen to your context. That's a brilliant thing to do. One of our social psychologists, academics in Cambridge, she said and wrote, being listened to is as close to being loved as to make no difference. Being listened to is as close to being loved as to make no difference. Ask yourselves, how many times recently has someone sat down with you and listened to you? It's a priceless gift. So if all you ever did was to listen to people in your context, you'll be offering them one of the greatest gifts that you could. If you then find a way to love and serve them, what a bonus. And if that's all you did, it'd be great for the kingdom. Jesus would be thrilled to bits. If on top of that community forms, and then they begin to find a way to explore Jesus, this is wonderful. That's a gift from the Spirit. It's probably not because of you, it's because of what the Spirit is doing. But if no one becomes a Christian, it doesn't matter in one sense, because you did something brilliant for the kingdom, which was to listen to the folks, love and serve them, and perhaps encourage your community to form. So we don't have to beat ourselves over the head, get all panicky. Have I made 10 converts or haven't I? You know, you just walk with the Spirit as far as the Spirit wants to take you in that journey, because it's His journey and you're simply following the Spirit and walking with the Spirit through it. So let me just stop there. That's just sharing something of what I've observed around the UK. It's been great to observe something similar here in Pittsburgh. It was great to hear of something similar happening in Brazil. This is a global work of the Spirit. And the more that we catch it and join in, the better. So, okay. So what I suggest is just for a couple of minutes, if you'd like to turn to your neighbors and just say, you know, what of that did I really respond to? Where would I like to have, you know, more? What do I want to hear about? What are the questions I've been left with? What do I disagree with? What do I want to say to the wider group? So just perhaps for 5 minutes or 3 minutes, just if you'd like to buzz together, and then we'll have a time of comment and questions. Who would like to start with a comment or a question?
One of the things we talked about, John and I talked about here, and one of my concerns has been the concept that came out of the emergent movement, emergent church, belonging before believing, building community first before insisting on belief, is that what happens a lot is it never gets to the believing part, that it stays with the building of the community, but there's never, or there's rarely a movement toward making the disciple before, with evangelizing the person and making them Christians. I know that's a work of the Holy Spirit, but you've got to be moving in that direction. And so what's happened a lot in the emergent church, and I don't know about fresh expression, so I don't know, but is there always an intention that the group or the outreach that you have has that intention that at some point, sometime, there's going to be an opportunity to receive Christ and to become a Christian?
I think on the ground, a lot of it is what actually happens, it's feeling your way. And there's a bit of me that's saying, yeah, I think this is appropriate, it's kind of the first wave, people don't really know what they're doing. But as we begin to learn some of these patterns of how the Spirit seems to work, then I think my advice to folks who are starting out is don't be too prescriptive about the journey. You don't know what the Spirit's going to do, but do have some intention. And one intention you might do right from the beginning is that you're going to pray and you're going to work and you're going to look for ways in which you can cooperate with the Spirit in forming people into the likeness of Jesus. And so you may think about what you're doing is whether that aids the journey. Because you see, you can do a lot of discipling before people become Christians. You know, some of these groups that I've been describing, we're doing precisely that. You know, we'll ask those on benefits to bring food because we want to model a way of Christian community where everyone is giving and receiving. You know, this is an important value. Phil and I were talking about how you might, this would be appropriate in some contexts but not others, but when you have a meal together, you might, as you institute that, say, let's have a rule here. You know, I'm a Christian, and this is the sort of thing that's really blessed me, is when I offer food to other people, I feel good because they thank me. So why don't we have a little practice here that the food on our plate, we've never helped ourselves to. Someone has always offered it to us and we've received it. And in some communities that would be great, other people it would just be awful. So you've got to be contextual. But you're modeling there again a practice in everyday practice of giving and receiving. So I think that as you do this, and you're intentionally thinking, how can we help? Then one of the things that you're thinking as communities form, but even before this, when you're listening, is what signposts to Jesus can we put in our conversations? Did you have a good weekend? Yeah, yes, thanks. It was a great weekend. In our church, we went away for the weekend. You know, you've begun to talk about Jesus in your life. You know, and it's quite okay to say, yeah, I had a great weekend, but church was really boring. You know, you've begun to be real about life as a Christian. And then the folks might say to you, okay, we know you're a Christian. You know, this has happened to me. My grandmother's died. Can you please pray? And you know, so just including this stuff in everyday conversation, it'll never go wasted, in inverted commas. You know, it'll come back to you in requests for prayer or questions or whatever. So yeah, I'm saying, you know, let's be intentional. Lots of small ways of doing it. And then as people seem to be ready to explore more, then you either do it one-to-one or you form them into small groups. And I mean, one woman, she had a mother and children's group. And they were great. They didn't go to church. And she said to the mums, she said, you know, would it be interesting for us to meet and explore spirituality one evening a week? The mum said, yeah, great. Those particular mums are up for it. So they agreed to meet. And then one of the mums said, well, how are we going to do this? So she said, well, Jesus is known as one of the world's greatest spiritual leaders. So why don't we look at the stories he told and see whether we agree with them? This is so easy. You hardly have to prepare. All you've got to do is to think which story we're going to look at this time. You read it through, you just make sure that you basically understand it. You perhaps, if you need to, read one commentary, and away you go. Now, if you're doing this with women, it's going to be dead easy because you just set them loose and they'll talk till kingdom come. So this is, you know, and then you go. And then the important thing is, and this is important for us clergy, because so often we clergy wreck it, is not to keep telling them what the answer is. So I used to run these Just Looking groups on a Monday evening for people who wanted to explore Christianity. And I had to control myself, because as we were studying the Bible together with people who've got very little church background, they would come up with interpretations of the text that no one in 2,000 years has ever come up with. And I would have to think, okay, Mike, keep control. And so I would just wait as they were talking and my hair was standing on end. I would wait for that tiny little bit which I agreed with, which might simply be that this is about Jesus, you know. And then I'd home in on that and say, you're absolutely right. This is about Jesus. And, how, you know, and build on that. So never, ever, ever tell them that they're wrong. Never in the early days, or perhaps almost ever. Because for most of the folks we deal with in the UK, and it may be different, because I sense that Americans are more extrovert and perhaps a bit more confident. But in the UK, the biggest barrier to becoming a Christian is I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. So if we tell them, yeah, not only you're not good enough, but you got this wrong. Whoa. You know. So all the time, my task as the leader of the group was as much a sort of, it was a spiritual task, but it was a psychological task. How could I help them grow in confidence? And then as they grew in confidence, it was wonderful the things that God would reveal through them about the Bible passage. So it's this sort of thing, okay? And again, you know, I go through these discussions and, oh, how do we make disciples? And it all seems such a problem. I don't think it is a problem. I think it's intuitive. You follow your nose, you pray for the Spirit's help, and then the golden rule. The golden rule, when you don't know what to do, you ask the people. Okay? The folks you're serving, when you don't know what to do, you ask them. So if you're thinking of growing a community together that explore Jesus, you don't know how to do that, you can't ask the people you're serving, then you're probably not ready to do it because you don't know them well enough. But you take them into your confidence. And then as this group meets, okay, it's a language cafe, and you say, well, you know, we're Christians and we'd love to somehow to share what God means to us. But we don't know how to do it in this group. What do you think? And then they begin to make suggestions. So the golden rule, which you Americans should really find very easy is ask the people. Okay, because you've been doing it all through your history, okay? In fact, I was sitting next to a lawyer on the plane. He said, we do it too much. We ask, all these judges have to go out and campaign and get themselves re-elected and so on. He'd been at a conference about all this. But, in Britain, well, we didn't really traditionally like asking the people, so it's a bit harder work for us. But ask the people, okay? Well, that's lovely, and for the sake of the tape, the summary of that, which is not as eloquent as the way it was put, is that this thing feels so humble, and it's quite different to a lot of church initiatives, and that's quite moving and touching. And I think I'd add, yes, it's a sign of the Spirit. I believe that, and that's I've always, when I'm with pioneers, I'm touched, especially by the ones that we've never heard of. There are some we ordain pioneers. We have a special track now where we recruit and train and ordain people into this pioneer ministry. And for them, somehow, it's not always quite the same humility, because it's become a career and they're given platforms. And this is great. We need their stories. If we didn't have their stories, we wouldn't be where we are today. So it's fantastic. But you get the pressures that work the other way. But for most of these folks in Liverpool, these 80 they surveyed, no one's ever heard of them. And it is very moving. Brilliant.
I really appreciated what you said about how each stage in the model has its own integrity and is important kingdom work.
Mm-hmm.
That really blessed me. The question I have is, it's frustrating as a church planner myself, to be constantly asked questions like, oh, well, how many people have you had on a Sunday, and how many baptisms, and because this is the kind of work that we're doing, and it's long and slow and little steps. So can you tell us both two things? First, how we can encourage each other in this work, and recognizing that each stage has its own integrity and is important, but also to what David said, but how also are we kept accountable in a way that makes sense with this model?
Yeah, I really empathize with your question, for which many thanks. My heart ached when a pioneer said to me, I think it was a he actually in this case, was ordained, and with the other clergy being ordained at the same time, they were training together. And, these other clergy didn't really get it, but they were trying to be nice, and friendly. And one of the ways you do that is to crack jokes. And he said, after 6 months, I came into a meeting, and, some of these clergy said, hi, how are you getting on? Have you planted a church yet? And he said, I just crumpled inside because I hadn't even got a team. And there are these, and funders and so on, and denominations want to see these results. The way I've been trying to think about this, to do the second part of your question, the way I've been trying to think about this, and it's still a work in progress for me, but I think there's a different way of discerning what God is doing. And you don't need always to discern by how many people have become Christians or how many people are you in touch with or whatever. Things that are very difficult to measure anyway in some of these contexts. But I think you can use that little journey I described as a way of discerning. So you might sit down with a bishop, archdeacon. You might just sit down after a year and say, well, tell me, how have you got on? You've been doing the listening stuff. How have you got on with that? What have you heard? What have you learnt? Where do you think you are? Do you think you're ready yet to do this next stage of loving and serving? Can you imagine how you do it? And you have that conversation, you say, well, it hasn't been revealed to us yet as a team. We don't really know. We've got these ideas here. And your bishop might say, or person you're with might say, well, why don't you just try something? And you say, oh, that's great. Would that be all right? Would it matter if it didn't work? No, go and do it. And so you meet again a year later, and you might say, well, where have I got to? Well, we did some of this loving and serving, and this seems to be... And so you talk about each stage of the journey. What have you done? Where have you got? What are you learning? What's God saying to you? What might you do next? And so this doesn't become a results-driven process. It becomes a sort of, let's look at your story so far. Let's share it together. Let's discern together. And your mentor or your coach or the person you're doing this with, the person in the diocese or denomination who you're accountable to, your parish rector or whoever, as you do this, that person might say, you might say, we feel stuck, like that language cafe said. We've got this star, we don't know where to go next. And they might say, well, actually, have you watched that DVD? Or have you gone and talked to those folks over there? Because they might be able to help you. And so you go and talk, and so you move forward. So instead of this accountability being a kind of pass or fail type thing, have you got the right numbers? Does this look encouraging? It becomes a sort of process of how do we walk this journey together? And I think if we can think of accountability like that takes off some of the burden, and it becomes a shared thing. And accountability is always mutual. I always say to folks, if you're talking about accountability in your local church, the first thing is the local church is accountable to you as the pioneer. They're accountable to you for providing you with the training and the support. So what do you call it? We call them church councils. You call them vestries. Has your vestry given you the support that you need? It's the first question. Only when the vestry can answer that question in the affirmative can they then say, well, are you doing your side of the bargain? How's it going? How's it working? So when there's that sense of mutuality, of sharing together, and of course, if you do this with a denomination or a church, I'm getting carried away here, but if you do it, then the denomination or the church should be saying, we want to learn from you. We want to add your experience to the bank of experiences that we're already familiar with, so we can see what sort of patterns God is weaving here in the diocese or the denomination. And we can use your experience to help other people. Let's listen to how you listened. And let's put that into the bank of knowledge and share that with other people. So all this becomes a deeply enriching process. And because it's so great, and because your knowledge is being shared with others, then, wow, I want that time. So it's not a moment of dread, it's a moment of anticipation and joy. So that takes me on to the second thing, which was, how can we support each other? And certainly in the UK, the dioceses that are really running with this are just drawing their pioneers, lay or ordained, together to meet regularly. In Liverpool, I think it's once a month. They just come and share what's going on. And so if there can be catalysts and conveners that can help that to happen, that's brilliant. Once a month, maybe too often, it may be once every 3 months. You do need, I sort of spell it out in the book, a whole list of support. You need your spiritual director or whatever. You need a mentor or a coach. You need some training. You need to meet up with peers who are working in a similar area. If you're working among young people who've got disadvantaged backgrounds, even if the person you go and talk to is not building a church, you need to meet with someone who's also worked in that area. And so there's a whole lot of support. And when I wrote the whole list, you need prayer partners. You need people around you who know about charity law and other legal things and health and safety stuff, if that's appropriate. So this is a lot of support. But we live in a very sophisticated world. And we can't expect to do this sort of stuff. We've got people's lives a little bit in our hands. So we can't afford to shortchange any of this. So, use the time for support. If you have to go to more meetings and everything takes a bit longer, then that's fine. Maybe it takes 3 years and not 2. Who cares? Better to lay the foundations. In one of the group of pioneers that were asked, who've been doing this for a while, what one thing would they do differently? And the majority vote was go slower. Go slower. So you just may want to tuck that away. Okay? Which is something in England where we go pretty slow anyway. So there we are. Now,
one of the things that I sense, at least from Jenny and others, is a movement in our diocese and in the movement as a whole is there was always kind of like there's the mother church, mothership, and then there's the plant. And what I'm hearing from Fresh Expressions is that, there's the established church and then there's this creative plant. And that this stuff arises right out of established churches where you're having these fresh expressions out in the community because your people are out in the community following their passion and going through these sorts of things. What's exciting about that to me is that it allows for that creativity in a community. I'm in a small town, so there are tons of places, pockets where some of that stuff could happen. What I'm hearing from you is there's all this creativity that can go on when the Spirit is kind of moving, and it's not sort of that either or. Am I right in hearing
you are
that?
right. If I've understood you right, there is all this creativity. It can happen independent of your local church. I'll come back and give an example, but you can happen that. But it can also be sponsored by your local church. So if I was a rector and I had a vision for this, I might say to myself, actually, I'm called to the pastoral ministry. This isn't my gift. But I might say my gift is, therefore, to pastor and support those who feel called to this. So
Yeah, and free them up to do that.
And free them up to do that. And give them permission. So what some of our churches are doing are changing their small groups. So a church might say, those of you who've got a passion for a particular demographic to reach them and serve and love them, come and tell us as church leaders. You just check that you trust them and got confidence in them. And then you put their names up, as it were, and say, anyone in the congregation wants to join them. Betty wants to work with homeless people. John and Jane want to work with families. These folks have got a heart for this apartment block or whatever. And then they're released to go and do that. And instead of meeting in a Bible study group, which is intensely inward-looking, they're released to go and do this. Now, these missional communities, that some people call them, sometimes they go one step further, and they say, you're so released that we don't really want to see you at church on Sunday for 2 or 3 Sundays of the month. We do want you to come on the 3rd or the 4th Sunday because we need to be together so we can learn from each other, envision each other, support each other. But otherwise, go worship in your little groups and use the time after you've worshipped to go and serve the people you're wanting to minister to. So you see, as a church, local church, you can. And I would be saying, please do, sponsor that. And if I was a rector and felt called to the pastoral ministry, I would want to say to those folks, you are the most important people. Because these folks who go out into the community and try to do something with their friends and so on, they're exposed. They're vulnerable. The 2 or 3 of them doing something together, they can look stupid. And they need someone who will ask them sensible questions. And when the vestry are all up in arms because they don't really understand what's going on, they need the rector to be defending and being their advocate and speaking on their behalf and explaining what's happening. So to bridge the misunderstandings. And so if ever we needed pastors in this ministry, we need them now. You see? So there's a room for everyone. If you're a pastor, pastor. If you're a pioneer and an entrepreneur, entrepreneurs. And it's creativity. Go to the passion. Okay, someone yesterday in the evening said, I came to faith. I'd been in church, I dropped out, but I love computer games. And in this particular computer game, you had the weak and the strong. And if you weren't strong enough, you couldn't get across the bridge. So in this game, if I wanted to get strength, I had to buy strength. But there was a Christian group in the game who gave me strength for free if I went and watched a little video. So I watched this little video. I'm not sure I would do it like this, but this is how they did it. So he said, I went and watched this little video about Jesus. And then I joined their online Bible study. And then having joined that online Bible study, I decided to reconnect with real life church, which is what he's doing now. Okay? Now you may say it's a little bit crude and but I just say there's something here that they're onto. Okay?
Now that's a fresh expression, if ever I heard one.
Okay, it's awesome. You could do that. Yeah. And I was so thrilled because for 8 years I've said to myself, how would I use the internet? And I always go to the extreme. You say, I'm not a great internet user. So I just went to the extreme. I said, what I would do is to set up a site with as many words spelled sex as I could. So I'd get them all in who are looking for sex. And then I would start having little bits about how to have safe sex, how to have good sex, how to have whole sex. And then I would move them on to how to have a whole life, how to have good life, and I'd move them on, and then I'd say, who's the source of this good life? And I'd take them and move them on so they begin to explore Jesus as the source of this life. Why not? Well, no one's done that yet, probably for good reason.
This is a really good time
probably for good reason.
to wrap this up, Mike.
Probably for good reason. Time to stop.
Yes, this is on tape, remember.
Thank you very much.